Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Patrick Doherty, and I'm the Deputy Director of the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. I'm really pleased to be up here on stage with one of New America Foundation's own, Stephen Hill. Stephen is part of the bedrock of our California program, and we're delighted to peel him away from the left coast for this afternoon. Stephen actually came to today's topic through his comparative research on how to improve the quality of American democracy. And in the midst of that research, three things struck Stephen. First, that Europe had lessons to teach America not only in the realm of democratic reforms, democratic process. Second, that the challenges recognized as strategic in Europe since the end of the Cold War were inherently different and bigger, I'd argue, than the challenges identified by Washington at the same time. And third, that the nature of European democracy allowed for a greater ability to adapt the European system to meet those challenges without compromising on fundamental European values along the way. With that in mind, Stephen has prepared a comprehensive picture of Europe's progress that is nothing less than eye-opening. Having myself lived and worked in Europe for years earlier in the last decade, Stephen's chronicling of the social, economic, and energy advances that European states have made is nothing short of breathtaking. And it anchors a new narrative that we all must absorb. For many, the notion that America lags behind Japan and South Korea on things like broadband and wireless connectivity is starting to be accepted. We're also internalizing the story about how China's economic rise is diminishing America's bargaining power and room for maneuver. Europe's Promise, Stephen's great book, tells another story, how the world's largest economy has systematically built a progressive, capitalist, democratic system that is anything but the stereotypes of 1970s-style social democracies, socialized medicine, and high gas taxes. Today, I hope that Stephen will break through these stereotypes and give you a small taste of the findings from his book. And I encourage everyone to go out and buy a copy and have him sign it afterwards. Before I introduce him, though, I just want to highlight one contribution from Europe's Promise that might otherwise go unremarked in a discussion of the details. Stephen premises this book on something that we don't get that often in Washington, a clear-eyed statement of the central challenge facing the world in the first half of the 21st century. Stephen writes, "The overarching challenge today is to advance the institutions and practices capable of enacting a desirable quality of life for a burgeoning population of 6.5 billion people, and to do all that in a way that is environmentally sustainable. That is a tall order to fill, yet it is the defining task of the 21st century." And that starts the book, and it just gets better from there. Let me introduce Stephen Hill for you really quickly. Stephen is the director of the Political Reform Program here at the New America Foundation and the senior analyst for the Center of Voting and Democracy. In addition to Europe's Promise, Stephen is the author of 10 Steps to Repair American Democracy and Fixing Elections, the Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Review, among others, and he's a frequent guest on national television and radio. Stephen's agreed to talk about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a conversation with the audience. In the meantime, I would ask everyone in the audience to silence their cell phones if you haven't already. And when we do get into the Q&A, if you can state your name and your affiliation with the microphone, because this is all being webcast live, and greetings to everybody on the internet. All right. With that, Stephen Hill.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and be back in Washington, D.C. to have a real substantive conversation. I think there's not a better time to do this kind of conversation in recent memory. I think right now there's a lot of people wondering about the American model and are there other models that perhaps might have something to offer. How do we enact healthcare in the United States? Can we look at other places that have already done this and learn something from them? And that really is, in some ways, is the goal of the book, is to promote more dialogue and help to have Americans look at other places, see what they're doing, see if there isn't something that we might not gain from that process. Europe's promise it's the story of post-World War II Europe, really, and how it has transformed itself into a model for how a modern society can develop itself, take care of its people, project its vision and power in the world, and do that in a way that's as ecologically sustainable as possible. And Europe has developed itself in really 5 key areas: the economic system and its attendant institutions and practices, increasingly important in this globalized world, in this age of greater economic insecurity, in its healthcare and its support for families and workers, and again, increasingly important in this age of economic insecurity, in the energy and transportation practices that it's using, increasingly important in this age of global climate change, and then also in political democracy and in foreign policy. And I'll touch upon as much of this as I can. But, as you probably picked up from the introduction, I direct the political reform program for New America. And so, you think, well, what does this necessarily have to do with political reform? And as Patrick alluded to, I began my study by studying the political institutions of Europe and making quite a few trips. This started in the late 1990s, making trips, interviews, and in the process of doing that, discovering a lot of new things about Europe that I did not know. And I think it's fair to say that going there to Europe as an American, I had a lot of the ideas in my head that you hear a lot of Americans say and a lot of the American media say. Some of them I came to discover were, I think, more stereotypes and myths than actual realities. And I'll bet that some of you could easily say some of the things you've heard about Europe. And so I'd like to do that a little bit. Let's hear from some of you. I know I'm putting you on the spot, so take a few seconds to think about it. But when you think of Europe, what do you think of? High taxes? Excessive welfare? Better representation of women? Eurosclerosis, the economy not growing. Any others?
Demographic disaster.
Pardon? Demographic disaster.
Differences in the regions and how they can participate.
Okay.
Difficulty in assimilating minorities.
Difficulty in assimilating minorities. So this is pretty much a lot of what I had in my head when I went to Europe as well, and found that some of them had certainly elements of truth, but others were perhaps more complex, and the reality was perhaps different than what I had learned. So, in terms of some of the myths, the myth that Europe has a weak, sclerotic economy, which you could read in the American media at length. And what I discovered was that Europe actually has the largest economy in the world. It actually produces nearly 1/3 of the world's output. It's actually, the economy is larger than the United States and China, or almost as large as the United States and China combined. Think about that. Europe has more Fortune 500 companies than the United States. It actually has more Fortune 500 companies than the United States and China combined. Its economies are regularly rated as the most competitive in the world by the World Economic Forum. From the years 1998 to 2008, Europe actually had a higher GDP per capita than the United States had, just slightly higher. And now, the land that we used to know as the land of high unemployment actually has lower unemployment than the United States has. The United States has 10% unemployment. The EU has 9.5%. Germany, which we might be able to get into, its unemployment rate has barely increased during this economic crisis because of the programs and policies they pursued. France, which we used to almost ridicule for high unemployment, now has the same unemployment as the United States. Europe is the largest trading partner with both the United States and China. It's had greater investment returns on your stock portfolios in Europe than in the United States. It's actually the place where American businesses, when they want to invest abroad, it's where they go, is to Europe. In fact, American businesses make 20 times more profit in Europe than they make in China. And but Europe is not just a place of Fortune 500 companies and big corporations, we think of the United States as the land of small businesses, and that you hear all the time that small business is the backbone of the United States, which certainly there's some truth to. But Europe actually has more small businesses than the United States, and those small businesses provide 2/3 of the jobs in Europe, and the United States, the small businesses provide about half of the jobs. So these were things that I found all sort of contrary to the conventional wisdom that I had certainly ingested. One of the other myths was that Europe is this welfare state, and the welfare state hamstrings the businesses. Well, with the numbers that I just cited, businesses seem to be doing quite well, despite what we call the welfare state. But the other thing that I learned about that was that, yes, in Europe you have people that have health care. And beyond health care, they also have a pretty generous retirement compared to Social Security. They also have paid parental leave, paid sick leave. They have free or nearly free university education, depending on the country. It's a lot less than it is in the United States. They have child care, what they call kiddie stipends. When a child is born, you as a parent receive $100, sometimes as much as $200 per month for diapers and some of the things you will need. You get that regardless of what income level you start at, whether you're wealthy or poor or middle class, you get your kiddie stipend. They have pretty efficient job training, senior care, on and on and on. So this is what we have known as the welfare state. But the more I looked into it, the conclusion I came to is that this was not welfare at all, at least not as Americans understand welfare, which is a pretty negative term as we tend to use it. But it was actually what I call in the book workfare, because it's really about giving support to families and individuals so that they can be as healthy and productive as they need to be in order to work in the economy and be productive and participate. Certainly there's abuses that go on, and a lot of people out there will pull out cherry pick statistics and such to show you those abuses. But the overriding theme was that this was about how do you actually make the workforce more productive and make sure that your society is healthy. It wasn't about welfare as we know it at all. So again, that was kind of an eye opener. I mean, I sort of had this insight when I was talking to one British representative who said, and Britain, of course, is a country that is sort of looked upon as being betwixt and between the United States and Europe, but even Britain has far more of these sort of workfare supports for families and individuals than we have here in the United States, and he was the one that really said, when you look at these different countries, it's really not about people kicking back; it's about people working. That's what these are about, and that's an important distinction to keep in mind. The other myth that I'll just talk about right now is the high taxes myth. It really depends on how you measure this, because sure, if you just go by income taxes, Europeans pay, for the most part, higher income taxes. But you just heard the list of workfare supports that families and individuals receive in Europe. So, if you're an American paying for health care and you're paying out of pocket, or you're paying a huge deductible or a copay or any of these sorts of things that Americans get hit with that Europeans don't tend to get hit with, you're paying more out of pocket for your health care. If you're going to college in the United States and you're, one of my siblings has told me he's saving $100,000 per child for his children to go to college education. That's a lot of money. And for a European is going to college for free or pretty darn close to it. And some of them implemented a few fees of a few $100s a year, but compared to even most state schools in the United States where you're paying $5,000, $6,000 a year for tuition, that's a lot of out-of-pocket payment that you as an American are making. Childcare. If you're paying for childcare out of pocket, that's something that many Europeans aren't paying for, and they're getting childcare. They might pay a little bit out of pocket, but there's all sorts of studies done that Americans pay a lot more out of pocket for childcare if they pay for it at all to have that. Sick leave. Americans are one of 5 countries in the world, and the other 4 are pretty small, impoverished African countries that does not have paid mandatory sick leave for its workers. And, this is an interesting thing to think about. What is the economic rationale behind having workers show up to work sick. And a lot of the workers who don't have jobs, because some people do get paid sick leave through their job, but the ones who don't tend to be service sector workers, food handlers. So when you go to a restaurant, if they don't have paid sick leave, the people handling your food may be sick, and they can't afford to stay home. What is the economic rationale behind that? Most of the world thinks there isn't one, and so as a result, they give paid sick leave. But so if you're an American worker and you have to stay home because you're sick and you don't get paid sick leave, you're self-subsidizing for that paid sick leave or by staying home. You're paying for it yourself. If you're a parent who has a child and you have to stay home from work and you don't have paid parental leave, the United States is one of the few countries that doesn't have mandated paid parental leave, you're self-subsidizing that. So senior care, you can look at the statistics, and Americans spend about the same amount on senior care as Europeans, but Americans are paying a lot more for it out of pocket, whereas Europeans are getting a lot more of it paid for as a result of paying their taxes. So when you add all this up, what you discover is that Americans don't really pay that much less, if at all any less than Europeans. We just get a lot less for our money. And so I think we have to really get beyond this Forbes tax misery index. You know, Forbes magazine puts out an annual estimate of their tax misery index, and you see the European countries up there as the most miserable, and the U.S. down there as one of the least miserable around Indonesia and Malaysia. And so I think you have to really question whether or not this is really the best way to measure these things, because if you're paying for it out of pocket but not through your taxes, what's the difference? I mean, some people say, well, at least it's discretionary because you're paying for it out of pocket. But a lot of the things we're talking about here, health care, child care, paid leave, I mean, in today's world, they're really not discretionary anymore. They're really about the quality of life that you're going to have as an American. And so I really think that these are the sorts of myths that we have to re-examine. And we have to really look at them in a new light, in a way that allows us to have a new conversation around these things. And just get past these myths in a way that allows us to have a more nuanced conversation. So the Europe's Promise sort of looks at these myths, but beyond that, it sort of steps back and takes a look at a bigger picture. And what it basically came to, the conclusion that I came to is that there's a European way that's rather distinct and unique in how it has developed in this post-World War II era. And that European way is quite distinct than the American way or the Chinese way or the Russian way. Certainly there's differences within Europe. There's no question about that. But by and large, the European countries, even Great Britain, share certain characteristics that America doesn't share at this point. And so there is this distinctive European way. I mean, in some ways, the European countries are different like American states are different. I mean, California is certainly different from Mississippi, and Massachusetts is different than Alabama. There are differences within the United States from state to state, and Europe has a similar characteristic. But by and large, there is this European way that I'm going to describe a little bit about. As you may have picked up from some of the information I've already said, the idea that Europe is socialist is just ridiculous. Europe is as capitalist as it comes. As I said, it has more Fortune 500 companies than the United States and China combined. But what Europe has learned to do is take the amazing ability of capitalism to create wealth. I mean, there's no question that capitalism is the greatest wealth creator, economic wealth creator the world has ever known. But Europe has learned how to harness that engine in a way that creates a more broadly shared prosperity. And they do that by creating these different workfare supports for their families and individuals. But they also do that by a number of other institutions. For example, one is called codetermination. Germany sort of pioneered this practice. Sweden is doing it. Many countries in Europe are doing different versions of this. And what codetermination is that the major corporations in Germany, of course, they have a board of directors, like all American corporations have, but 50% of those board members are elected by the workers. How many people have heard of that? I'm curious. A few hands. This is a more educated crowd than most. Other places where I've talked about this, no one has heard of this. So Mercedes, BMW, Siemens, all these large corporations have a board of directors in which 50% of the board members are elected by the workers. Imagine Walmart, if its board of directors, if 50% of its members were elected by the workers. I mean, some of you are snickering because, if one, we can't even imagine that, but two, it's easy to realize how that would make Walmart a different corporate, have different corporate behavior. And so this is a rather important practice, and there's a lot of studies in Europe about the impact of co-determination. One in Sweden, where in Sweden 1/3 of the directors are elected by workers, in which even corporate CEOs said, yeah, I had mixed feelings about this co-determination stuff, but actually it's worked out pretty well. Because what it means is that it really enhances what they call consultation throughout the organization. It means that the CEOs and the executives of that corporation have to confer fairly extensively with their workers. And it doesn't mean that they still can't strike their own path and do what is profitable for their corporation. As I said, Europe has more Fortune 500 companies than the United States has. These are profitable companies. But it means that they have to do it more in coordination with what their workers want. It means that, for example, in Germany, during this economic crisis, I mentioned earlier about how their unemployment rate has barely gone up. Well, here's why. Because in Germany, instead of laying a ton of people off, like we've done in the United States, where our unemployment rate has actually more than doubled since the economic crisis began, they did what's called part work, short work, Kurzarbeit. And what that meant is that instead of laying off people, all the workers in a company would work less. Instead of working 100% of the time, they'd work 90% or 80%. Now, the other thing that Germany did was they had a little bit taken out of every worker's paycheck during the good times, and the government sort of put that aside so that even though, say, a worker goes from 100% to 80%, they're still going to make 90% of their salary. And the goal behind this is that, one, is to lay off fewer people, because when you lay off people, and especially in an economic decline, it's tremendously disruptive, because what happens is you lay off people, they have less money to spend, so they spend less, so businesses have now fewer customers. Maybe they have to lay off more people, now they have less money. That's the economic downward spiral that we're trying to reverse here. In Germany, by keeping more people employed, you keep more people with money in their pockets. And so consumer spending doesn't take quite a hit as much as it has in the United States. It also means that you keep your workforce intact. So when the when things pick up again, you have your workforce there instead of having disrupted your workforce. And you're also not picking winners and losers in your society quite the way we are here. I mean, you have people now who are laid off, can't find jobs. Some of them aren't even in the economic statistics anymore, the unemployment rate anymore, because they're discouraged workers. And they don't have health care. They don't have any kind of supports for them to speak of. People get really destitute. That's not good for your society. Well, in Germany and other places in Europe, that doesn't happen to that extent. Nowhere near that extent, actually. So co-determination and what it can lead to, this consultation between the workers and the leaders of the business, seems to have worked out quite well. And now in the U.S. press, when you hear them, they don't really mention the word co-determination. What you'll hear is that in Europe there's a lack of, quote, labor flexibility. And that's kind of the code word for a CEO can't just walk in and do whatever she or he wishes and fire people or transfer operations. They have to consult with workers. But again, think of companies like Mercedes, BMW, Siemens. These are very profitable corporations. It's not like these are businesses that are on the ropes, strangled by red tape and bureaucracy like, the myth says. Instead, these are businesses that are doing quite well. In fact, it's hard to compare the U.S. auto industry at this point to the German auto industry, because the U.S. auto industry is on the ropes, even though they've had the most labor flexibility and less supposed bureaucracy and red tape than in Germany. So again, we have to re-examine these myths and not just take them at the reported face value. The other thing that Europe has specialized in quite a lot is public-private partnerships, especially when it comes to funding development, infrastructure development. In the U.S., it's sort of ironic because we think of ourselves as this free market economy, when the government goes to develop infrastructure in Europe, they do a lot of things to float bonds and to get the private sector involved in putting up money in return for profits on that money to invest in public infrastructure. Whereas in the U.S., we mostly have left it up to government funding to do public infrastructure. There's this sort of suspicion suddenly when it comes to creating public infrastructure around public-private partnerships that Europe doesn't share, which again is kind of contrary to the myth that they're more government-oriented and we're more private sector-oriented. In Europe, you have the public sector and the private sector doing more things towards public infrastructure. Some of the other things they have in Europe is what's called works councils. At every job site, in most countries, not all, but most, you have the workers get to band together and elect their own representative. It's separate than a labor union. They have labor unions as well, but this is a separate creature in which they get to confer, again, extensively with their employers about issues having to do with the day-to-day work schedule, and if they're going to try to lay people off, well, let's instead of lay people off, let's do more of this work share sort of thing. So in multiple levels, they have this consultation that you hear this word a lot in Europe: consultation, that in America we don't have much patience for. And I think that's unfortunate, because now is a time where we need to. The business people I talk to in Europe about these consultation techniques have said that it actually makes their decision making more efficient, because by the time they reach their final decision, it's been more of a business-wide discussion in a way that brings people in and doesn't shut them out, so that you don't incur the backlash that you might get if suddenly you're laying off a bunch of people or changing their health care or whatever you might be doing in America that causes so much tension between management and labor. So let's shift focus a little bit. One of the other areas where Europe, I think, is forging a new model, and not just Europe, I should say, Japan also is doing some interesting things, but that's in the area of healthcare. And it's a good time to talk about that, because here in the United States we are going through fits and starts trying to reform our healthcare plan across the United States. And in Europe, they've sort of taken a different approach. And here's an example that's good to talk about, because it shows how, before you can even do some of these reforms or change your practices, you really have to have a conversation about what your values are and what you're valuing. Because depending on what your values are, you'll design a completely different system. And so in Europe, they've made the judgment that the value in their healthcare they want to support is people instead of profits. Whereas in the United States, the value that we have put is people, yes, but companies are allowed to make profits off of people's healthcare. And based on that, you design a different system. And so you have countries in Europe like Britain that has the single payer, or what we call socialized medicine. But actually, most countries in Europe do not have that. Countries like Germany and France and Belgium and Switzerland have instead what I call a shared partnership healthcare plan, where employers and employees all kick in a certain amount. Usually it's about 7% of salary, thereabouts. And then if an individual can't afford that, the government will help make up their share. So that's one aspect, which is not that different from how America works in certain ways, except that, they're trying to do something like that, or the Obama administration is trying to do something like that. But here's the key difference, is that in Europe, they actually have, in France, Germany, and other places, private insurance companies. It's not all government-owned healthcare. And in fact, Germany has over 200 private insurance companies, but they're all nonprofit. That's a huge difference. So these insurance companies have different incentives for how to act. In addition to that, every year or two, the different stakeholders in the healthcare system, including consumer representatives and the insurance companies and the government and nurses and doctors, they get together and they negotiate all the fees and services, how much is going to be paid, kind of like what we do in Medicare now. So this combination of employer-employee contributions, nonprofit insurance companies, and negotiated fees and services. This has created a much different healthcare system than what we have here in the United States, and it's been amazingly effective, both in terms of cost. The United States is spending 16 to 17% of GDP on our healthcare, and in Europe they're spending about 8, 9. Some of France which has the #1 rated healthcare system in the world, spends about 11% of GDP. So they're spending quite a lot less money than we are, and then the statistics across the board show that they're getting better results. Their people are healthier. France and Germany, the waits are actually shorter than they are in the United States. It's not like in Britain and Canada where you hear the horror stories about how long you'll wait for surgery and such. It's not like that in these other countries. And in addition, you don't have the anxiety that, in America, we actually have an incentive when you go to your doctor to not tell her or him the truth because of the pre-existing condition clause and all these other things, right? Depending on what you tell them, they may say, sorry, we're not going to treat you. Those kind of things don't go on in this nonprofit system because it's a different value. Different institutions have been structured around those values, and you get different practices as a result. So I think this is really a key thing that we can learn from. We're not getting our bang for our buck when it comes to healthcare. Some people will say, well, healthcare in America is good for some people and not for others. And I have good healthcare, so I don't want to endanger that. And I feel sorry for the people that don't have healthcare, but it just makes me uneasy. But they've actually done studies about the quality of healthcare for, say, wealthy Americans who all have healthcare. And their health is not even as good as middle-class people and even poor people in Britain on a number of measurements of how you measure health. So no matter where you are in the American healthcare spectrum, you're not getting healthcare as good as it could or should be. It doesn't mean that we don't have some good doctors and good hospitals and that you don't get some things fixed, but it's costing us a lot of money. President Obama is correct that it's going to bankrupt the nation over time, and there are other countries that are doing it for a lot less money and getting a lot better care. So it seems like we need to get outside that box and start looking at what other places are doing. The third area I'll talk about just briefly. How are we doing on time? The third area I'm going to talk about where Europe is really an innovator and leader is in the area of global climate change and what they're doing in energy and transportation. I could talk about this for hours. There's so many interesting things going on in Europe, both in terms of using renewable technologies in a more widespread fashion, but also implementing just basic conservation technologies that are available today, the low-hanging fruit using existing technology. We're not talking about inventing new forms of energy, but just, for example, changing all the light bulbs to the low wattage light bulbs that we have today. The EU has passed a regulation saying by a certain date, we all must be using the low wattage light bulbs. Having motion sensor lights in your buildings so that your downtown buildings at night, how many people have gone by downtown buildings and seen them on at 3 o'clock in the morning? Maybe janitors are there cleaning up, but maybe not. Maybe some people just left the lights on. And so you could have motion sensor lights that they don't have to go down to darkness, but it goes down to a much dimmer level that saves a lot. Standby power in all appliances. How many here have a toaster where it's always got a light on? Mine does. You can't. It's a light on. You can't turn it off. Our stereos now, they make them so that there's always lights flashing on them, whether you're playing something or not. This is called standby power. And Europe has passed regulations to reduce standby power down to 10% of what it used to be. Their toilets flush less water. Their car engines are about half the size. Their houses use less energy and emit less carbon because of many of the practices that they've implemented. And then in addition to that, they've started down the road of some really big projects on renewable energy. So you have solar power that's really growing exponentially in Europe, and particularly in countries like Germany and Spain and Portugal, in which they have both rooftop solar panels on people's homes, but they're building these vast, huge solar arrays that are really very modern. The mirrors track the sun, so you get the most efficient use. That's starting to produce serious amount of megawattage in these countries. They also have wind power that they've been developing for a number of years. Germany now is receiving about 20% of its electricity from wind power. Again, these are not the old Dutch windmills that you might have seen. These are high-tech windmills that they actually move quite slowly, but they produce a lot of power. In addition, Europe is doing a lot on sea power. One of my favorite technologies that I'd never heard of before is off the coast of Portugal. They have these things called sea snakes. They're these huge tubes, about 100 meters long, 10 meters in diameter, and they can link them together, and they just bob in the surf with pistons between them. And as these pistons are driven up and down by the motion of the waves, it makes electricity that is then brought to the coast. And so especially for coastal villages where it's hard to run electric lines to them, this is great technology. And Portugal was the first to do it, working with various companies. Some of the U.S. companies have been involved in developing this technology, but they can't find customers here. And then Scotland now is going to create a big grid that's going to, it's estimated it's going to power about a third of the households in Edinburgh. They're also doing things like imagine taking a windmill and sinking it underwater and anchoring it to the seafloor. And you can create vast farms of these. And they're doing that off the coast of Britain, producing a tremendous amount of megawattage with really no pollutants at all. And they're saying that eventually they're going to have a big enough farm to power about half the homes in London. It's a lot of homes. So these are the sorts of things that are going on in Europe, and there's a number of others that, as I said, I could talk about this for some time. And when you put it all together, the other thing I should mention, high-speed trains, of course. Europe has really pushed a lot on high-speed trains, and in the U.S. we're still quite behind on that. I mean, the Acela train doesn't even come close to what they call high speed in Europe, and in China is starting to push forward a lot on high speed trains. And so here's another area where we're really falling behind. And Barack Obama in the stimulus back in February did put some more money towards high speed trains, but the amount of money compared to what Europe and China is spending is really quite small. So when you add all this up, what you find is that Europe has what is called the ecological footprint, which is the amount of resources of the planet that your country or society uses. Their ecological footprint is half of that of the United States for the same standard of living. So it really shows that there is a way for a modern society and to enjoy a standard of living and reduce your ecological footprint, reduce your carbon emissions in a way that does not hamper your economy. These can be done. Oh, I have to mention one other thing that the Danes are doing that are really quite interesting. It's called cogeneration. When you produce energy, say at a power plant, only about 60% of the fuel you use to produce that energy actually turns into energy. The other 40% is turned into heat and goes up the smokestack and is lost. Well, in Europe, they've pioneered how to take that 40% heat and reroute it to do good things. And in fact, in Denmark, they've actually torn up the streets. Some of it was projects on the order of what a pharaoh would have to command to create this project, to take that heat and put it into pipes and take it to the local town to heat homes. This stuff is all doable. In Sweden, they take the body heat from commuters on a train, and they're able to take that body heat and channel it to heat buildings in the train station. So these are the types of things that are going on in Europe in a way that I think is really quite creative, innovative. They're looking for ways to redesign buildings. One thing they've done in Germany is they for these buildings, they've drilled down into the ground until you get to the point where the temperature is the same regardless of the time of year. And so then you can pull that air up, and then to either heat it or cool it, it takes very little energy in order to do that. And the amount that you pay in extra to build a building like this is really quite small. It repays itself within just a few years. So they're looking at ways where they have the lighting adjusts for the time of day when it's much brighter. The lighting in the building itself starts dimming automatically. They're just doing all sorts of things to create what's called smart buildings that can, because the residential and building sector actually produces 25% of carbon emissions in the world. And by really going after that with some of these technologies that are already developed, it's not like we have to wait for new technologies. As I said, this is what's called, the McKinsey Global Institute put out a report reporting on all these things, and they call this the low-hanging fruit. This is stuff that's immediately available that the United States could implement with just the right policies and would immediately reduce our carbon emissions and our ecological footprint. So we really, I think we really, we don't have to be afraid of this. We can see that it actually can work. It's working in Europe. They have reduced their ecological footprint. Their economies are still strong and vibrant by any way you want to measure it. Sure, they suffer the economic fluctuations like now, right? Everyone's experiencing it. So you can always cherry pick data and say that at this particular time, this particular country is having a hard time. You can do that if you want to skew the conversation one way or another. But I don't think at this point we benefit much from that type of approach. At this point, I think it's best to be non-ideological about this. This is not about socialism versus capitalism. Europe is very, very capitalist in its orientation. It's just, as I said, it's figured out a way to harness capitalism to create this broadly shared prosperity in a way that is much closer to being ecologically sustainable. There are some challenges that Europe's faced, and I go into these in the book, namely in terms of immigration and the Islamic issue. And there's also challenges in terms of some countries losing population and how that affects their ability to pay for their workfare supports and what's called the dependency ratio, how many workers do you have working to support how many people who are not working, either elderly and retired or children. And the quick conclusion I came in both of these matters was that first, Europe realizes they have a problem in these regards, and they're dealing with it in certain ways that we'll have to see how it plays out over time. I didn't find that you could immediately conclude that somehow this is going to be the end of Europe. As I titled the section of the book where I have these chapters, "The End of Europe?" ? I don't think that's what we're looking at here. I think we're looking at, in terms of, for example, immigration, we're looking at a place that for the longest time only had small minority populations. And now they realize that as the minority population has grown quite a lot, they realize they have to deal with it. They're sort of at a place where we were maybe in the 70s, I think, in coping with this. They haven't had the tumult that we had in the 50s and 60s in the United States in dealing with it. There's a huge amount of money being spent in the European Union right now to create the conditions that allows for better integration. Bilingual programs, money spent to support certain communities that have been hit harder by unemployment, all these sorts of things. It's a complicated picture, and when I'd be happy to go into it more during Q&A. And again, this is another area where the conversation is not well served by dwelling on stereotypes regarding this. And the same with population decline. They're dealing with it, and it's going to be interesting how it plays out. Europe is certainly a work in progress. There's no question about it. There are no guarantees how things are today. We'll see how it is 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. But I think that Europe is certainly trying to grapple with the real challenges today around economic insecurity and global climate change in a way that is hard for America to do when you need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything done, right? So I think in that way we can learn a lot from Europe, and I hope that the book is a contribution towards that. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Fascinating. And actually, you ended right on the point that I wanted to pick up on. And to combine your two worlds of Europe and kind of the electoral process, just to really look at the question of what does a supermajority requirement do to the democratic process or the problem-solving process in the United States? How has Europe overcome this question of the ability to adapt? We just before we came up here on stage, I got the alert that Nancy Pelosi announced that she doesn't have the votes to pass the Senate version of the healthcare bill, and so that puts this whole thing into the big question mark of whether or not the Obama administration is going to be able to pass this thing. How does Europe overcome this? How does Europe have the ability to adapt
through the political process. It's clear that you've talked in this presentation a little bit about how companies are adapting through their governance, but could you talk a little bit more about the role of proportional representation, the role of some of the democratic process improvements that you found in Europe?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, there's no European parliamentary chambers where you need 60% of the vote to get anything done. I mean, I can't think of any chamber around the world where you need such a high threshold. And in fact, in the United States, we didn't used to need such a high threshold. Somehow, this one has snuck in under the tent, into the tent, and no one's quite sure how it got here. I mean, of course, people do know about the history of the filibuster and such, but it's never been used as much before, and it's really anti-democratic. In fact, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who are credited with designing much of the Constitution, they were opposed to the creation of the Senate. They said that the Senate would undermine national majorities, and they have been right ever since. The U.S. House of Representatives passed resolutions to get rid of slavery many times throughout the early 19th century, and it always died in the Senate. And the Senate, it's supposed to be the place that slows things down and makes us be more deliberative, and maybe it served that role to some degree. But in fact, that's not what it serves today. It's the place of paralysis. It's where things go, where major policy measures go to die. And that's what we're seeing going on right now. And it's tragic because the United States has such an important role to play in the world. And the world is looking at this. When Obama showed up in Copenhagen and, Europe had proposed a 20% reduction in carbon emissions by 2020. And they said, and we'll go to 30% if the U.S. matches us. And other countries too, Canada and Australia and others. But really, the U.S. was the key because we are the largest per capita polluter in the world, by far more than China. Even though our carbon emissions are about the same, China has 4 times as many people. So we're emitting far more carbon per person than any other place in the world. And Obama showed up with a proposal that was laughable, and it seems as if he thought he could sort of sneak one by everybody. He said, okay, we'll do 17%. But it was 17% of 2005 levels, whereas the standard has always been whatever percentage you do, it's of 1990 levels. 17% of 2005 levels was actually about 3 to 4% of 1990 levels. Once the U.S. showed up in Copenhagen with that proposal, at that point, China and India said, well, if you guys aren't going to do anything, we're not going to do anything. I mean, 3% of 1990 levels is, statistically, it's almost insignificant. And so this is the problem that we're having, not only with healthcare, but with climate change, and we're going to see it with just about every issue because the partisan climate is such that the Republicans are determined to use the filibuster, as the Democrats have done before them, basically to continue what we call the permanent campaign in the United States. So Europe has taken a different track. One, you don't have 60% thresholds in your legislature. 2, they have created a more multi-party democracy where they use systems of proportional representation instead of one district at a time. It can be countrywide, it can be region-wide. There's different ways to construe it. But basically the idea is you want to give people representation. So you have parties to the left and the right, but you also have parties in the center. You can have center-right, center-left parties, far-right, far-left parties. There's a basic value there that people deserve representation. If you're going to ask them to pay taxes and to pay into your social systems, they deserve representation. Whereas in the United States, even beyond the Senate, looking at how we elect the House of Representatives, most districts right now, we can tell you who's going to win most of these districts in 2010. It's going to be a handful of swing districts that are going to decide whether some of them go back and forth, but most of them are done deals. And so you have millions of Republicans living in Democratic districts and millions of Democrats living in Republican districts that they have no hope of electing a representative, not to mention third party and independents in the United States that have no hope of electing anyone in most cases anyway either. So the system we have is old, it's antiquated, it's 18th century, it's what we've been using for a couple of centuries. And Europe has come along and created these modern methods where the goal is to give people representation. Now, some people say, well, that's led to weak, inefficient coalition governments. Well, we've been talking about some of the things that Europe has accomplished, Germany, Sweden, and all these other places. Are these the things of weak, inefficient coalition governments? As I said, they've accomplished things that we haven't accomplished in the United States. Croatia has universal health care. So, I mean, maybe we need some of that weak, inefficient coalition government if it's going to lead to some of the things that that they've been able to get in Europe. I mean, Europe's political institutions and its democracy, including public financing of campaigns, free airtime for parties, so that you have robust public debate. It's not the debate isn't just those who can write checks, and we could talk a whole lecture just on that alone. These are the changes that Europe has made to create a robust democracy where the issues of the day are fiercely debated, both during the campaigns and outside the campaigns. And not every election in Europe is fiercely debated. I mean, the last election in Germany, was somewhat of a snoozer. But I mean, by and large, for the most part, the issues are having a vehicle for being aired. And in the U.S., it seems to be a lot more difficult. So I think Germany does some other interesting things. For example, they have something called children's parliaments. And I was interviewing the deputy mayor of Cologne, Germany, and she mentioned this. I'd never heard of it. I said, well, children's parliament, what's that? And she said, well, about every quarter, the students elect their own parliament using proportional representation. So they have multiple views represented. And they get to propose legislation to the city council. And at the time, this was in the late 90s, Los Angeles was going through a process that led to neighborhood assemblies. And one of the discussions there was, should these neighborhood assemblies be able to propose things to the city council? And there was huge amounts of pushback on that proposal. It was really interesting that here in Germany, they let children propose things to the city councils, but in Los Angeles, they didn't want the adults proposing things to the city council. So it's, again, different values, different attitudes. And I said, well, what do the children propose? They propose chewing gum in school, silly things. She said, no, it's completely serious. They think of things that the adults wouldn't think of. They think of, like, they put some rocks down in the playground. They said, you try kneeling in that. It hurts. We need softer materials. Move the buttons down on the trains, because they use trains a lot to go back and forth to school, so that the smaller children can hit the button on the trains. They wanted their particular city, Cologne, to become a sister city to a city, I think it was in Brazil or something like that. So, they were actually, it really inspired the children to be involved in politics from their point of view, and to learn that politics can be a positive vehicle to get things that you want. And she said, yeah, it's literally true. After the parliament's reached, we get a big stack of legislation that we have to work through, each one of them, and we have to take it serious, because if we don't take it seriously, then the children are going to think it's a waste of time. So it's, there's a lot of things going on in Europe, again, within this area that I think that we could learn from.
Great. Let's open it up to the floor. Gentleman right here, and Andrew right here in front of you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Leon Weishaupt from the University of Wisconsin-Washington Semester in International Affairs. A lot of what you said, you indicated, was due to attitudes, values. A lot of it, I think, also has to do with how do you allocate a finite amount of resources. I'd like to ask you about what I've heard occasionally from members of Congress and others when they're asked about these things, and that Europe has been allocating a lot of its resources due to a free ride on the defense expenditures of the United States. Now, I'm not asking for Europe to become a global superpower, but just in taking a few examples, in the implosion of the former Yugoslavia, in the ouster of Iraq from when it invaded the country of Kuwait, there was a lot of anguish about it in Europe, but somehow they didn't muster the ability, the will to perform until the United States, with its huge defense expenditures on overhead, global reach, whatever you want to call it, enabled us to put together a coalition either through NATO or through the UN Security Council. So basically what I'm asking is, are the Europeans able to allocate a lot of these resources to healthcare, to kinder care, whatever else it may be, simply because they don't have to allocate that huge amount of resources to national defense and security?
Right. Yes, it's a very good question, and many people, again, this is another thing that we hear a lot, is that Europe is a free rider on American foreign policy. And there's no question in the post-World War II era that Europe benefited from not having to spend huge amounts of money on defense, and and especially during the superpower U.S. versus Soviet Cold War struggle, it was really Europe was able to sort of fit into a comfortable niche there and develop a lot of these institutions that I've discussed, and really take. Interestingly, the modern Europe was proposed by the conservative politicians of Europe. People like Winston Churchill, Konrad Adenauer, Jean Monnet. These were not leftists or socialists or anything of the nature. But after the destruction of World Wars I and II, and indeed centuries of destruction, they finally decided we've got to stop putting our money into the military machines that all these countries were to one degree or another, and start putting into things that will prevent the conditions that lead to World War I and led to World War I and World War II. So they were content to. There was already their own, attitudes about we've got to stop our military spending, and they were content to do that while America spent theirs. Flash forward now to 2010, the world's a very different place. Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The threats today are not what they were. And so I think there's a question of, does the U.S. have the right foreign policy? Are we spending our money efficiently on our military in a way that doesn't drain our country? And maybe we have something to learn from Europe and its smart power. One myth I should dispel, however, is that the idea that Europe doesn't spend much on defense. Europe actually has, when you aggregate the countries together, has the second largest defense budget in the world. They actually spend more than China does, though there's some dispute about how much China really spends. But with the official figures that we know of, Europe is spending about $300 billion compared to the U.S. spending about $600 billion. And Europe has two nuclear powers, that's France and Britain. They actually have more soldiers in uniform than the United States has. They have a lot of soldiers in various global hotspots, including the Congo and Afghanistan. They've had some, different countries have had some in Iraq. So, they also have a rapid deployment force that does bring some European countries, the soldiers from different countries together into one force. Now, they have military hardware, tanks, helicopters, these sorts of things. Certainly, they're not a continent-wide force as the American military is. But again, the question is that really what's needed today in 2010? There are some analysts, I'm not a military expert, but some of the military analysts believe that a big part of the U.S. military is still geared towards fighting World War II. And it's not geared towards fighting the current threats that we see in the world today. And let's face it, a lot of that military spending is because it's tied to certain congressional members' districts, and it's just pork barrel spending. It's jobs. It's a jobs program. So comparing military budgets is not necessarily the best way to really analyze these things, in my view. And then in addition, the Soviet threat isn't here anymore. Who's the threat in the world today? Perhaps if we polled people, they would say the biggest threat to the United States today is perhaps who? Iran? Well, is Iran a threat on the order of the Soviet Union? No, I think not. Iran's economy is actually about the size of New Jersey's. Okay? Iran is a poor country that is struggling to develop itself in a hostile environment. It's a country that has been in a state of confrontation with the United States for many decades. And it's a country where it now has troops from this country in the country known as Afghanistan, which, if you look at the map, has a very long border with Iran. So, I think, again, we have to look at the bigger picture on this and not just accept the headlines. And actually, some of the people in the New America Foundation, like Flint Leverett, who has worked with Condoleezza Rice at the National Security Council and eventually left there, he and others have been at the forefront of saying we need to promote what's called a grand bargain for Iran, where we put the major issues on the table and we try to negotiate some of these. It doesn't mean you do it from a place of weakness, and doing that isn't appeasement. It's a matter of using techniques that, look, after World War II, we used the Marshall Plan to build up Europe and Japan. It was one of the greatest, most benevolent acts a conquering, victorious power ever did. And where is that United States from in the post-World War II era that did Marshall Plans? That's what I would like to really hear us discuss more. That, and this is where Europe comes in, is Europe basically, when you look at its foreign policy, Western Europe created Marshall Plans for Central and Eastern Europe. Now Central and Eastern Europe are, for the most part, merged into the European Union, and they are extending that attitude to places like Turkey. places like Ukraine, even to Russia to some extent, using a process of slow, patient engagement to bring people slowly on board. I mean, comparing the foreign policy of Europe in Turkey to the U.S. in Iraq, I think is instructive. There are certainly differences, but I think it's important to think about. I mean, here's Turkey that used to be run by a military dictatorship. It had a human rights record on the order of Saddam's Iraq. And Europe started on a process with Turkey of slow, patient engagement with dangling the carrot of EU admission at some point. And as a result of that, you see that Turkey today is a westernized Islamic democracy. Its standard of living has increased dramatically. Its treatment of the Kurds has improved dramatically. There's still issues there, but compared to where it was 20 years ago, it's night and day. You have Kurdish language newspapers and radios, and you have Kurdish members in the parliament today. And Iraq is still, in many ways, a tinderbox that's created a lot of issues in the region. And in addition, the EU has spent about 1/10 of the amount of money in Turkey that we've spent in Iraq. So what this suggests to me is that the European way of foreign policy, and I have 2 chapters in the book about this, is proposing a new way to enact global stability and security. And that has to do with, they've learned well from the United States, using aid, trade, investment, Marshall plans, these sorts of things, engagement, slow, patient engagement to bring these countries along instead of using the hard stick that the U.S. seems to reserve. And in Europe, it's not just because they're weak. Philosophically, they don't agree. As one Europe diplomat put it to me, the U.S. is kind of like a bull that carries around its own china shop. And so, I think that, it was interesting that Barack Obama, he said he was going to consult more with allies and then launched his Afghanistan program with really not consulting with Europeans at all and basically saying once again, as the Bush administration did, please give us troops. And Europe politely said, no, we're not going to. We don't believe the threats are as you have analyzed them to be, and we don't believe the intervention is the one that you're trying to do. I think Europe has said that about as loudly and clearly as you do in diplomatic circles, but the U.S. seems to be tone deaf.
Great, thank you. Okay, the gentleman on the corner and the lady in the red after. So, thanks.
Henry Farrell, George Washington University. 2 questions. I guess, first of all, I buy the basic argument that the US would be better if it was like a number of European states. What I'm very skeptical about is the argument that there is something like a European model. And to take one of the examples that you talked about a lot, co-determination, so this idea that you have the workers and management working together. As you know, this only applies in a very small number of European countries. You have big states like the UK, which is of course much more like the US. You have France, where relations between workers and management are traditionally, historically, extraordinarily hostile. You have Italy, which is it's Italy. And you have, you just have an enormous degree of variation there, which I just don't think really can be resolved down into a model. Some European states are pretty good about this consultation stuff. Some are not so good. And also when you look at things like work councils, if you look at what's happening to work councils in Germany, the best political economists suggest that the system is basically gradually being eroded and disintegrated from the bottom up.
So you turn it into a question.
Yeah. So I guess the answer to the question is there actually a single European model, or are you bringing together a whole bunch of things which sort of sound the same if you look at them quickly, but which actually turn out to be very different? And the second question, much more quickly, is in the response on global warming, I think given the craziness of the last couple of days, it's tempting to blame the supermajority requirement of the filibuster. But if you look at the European Union, it itself had to confront its own internal procedures of decision-making when it came to the table with that offer. I can't remember whether it had to make a unanimous decision among all member states or a qualified majority. But either which way, there was there was some supermajority requirement, and perhaps a very extreme one. So I'm not sure that this really explains why Europe gets it on global warming and why the US does not.
Great. Thank you.
Well, on the first one, in terms of the European model, certainly, and I've already said that there are differences from country to country, but there are also differences from state to state in the United States. And so what I tried to look at in the book is what is the overall trajectory, and especially comparing, again, what's the European way compared to the American way or the China way? Is there something definable there? And I concluded that there was, notwithstanding your comments. But also I'll say that in these different countries, some of them are using co-determination representation on boards of directors more than others. Some have a half of the directors elected, some a third, some only have a few representatives on them. About half of the countries, according to the research that I was able to find, and again, this information is not always that easy to find, to dig it out, but about half the countries have some form of the co-determination, the supervisory board representation. And pretty much all the countries have some form of works council. Some have it in all work sites. Others have it in work sites above a certain number of employees. And again, you're going to see at any given time, when you take a snapshot in a country like Germany, you're going to see some of these working better or worse than they did 5, 10, 15 years ago. There's certainly going to be flux. Is Germany in any way looking to junk its works council or co-determination? Certainly not. Even Angela Merkel, who's the conservative in Germany, the chancellor there, when you read some of her statements about her commitment to this social capitalism, as I call it in the book, you'd think she was, on the American spectrum, you'd think she was from the far left or something. Her statements about, preserving the social model and preserving consultation and all these sorts of things are something that are quite unlike what you would hear an American politician say. And even in the UK, they have works councils in the UK. They have other practices that promote what they call consultation. And so really, if there's any overriding theme in Europe, it's this notion of consultation where the workers have input into what happens in their workplace. Here in the United States, I can tell you that any sense of consultation is very dependent on the employer, her himself, and whether they want to deal with that. There's nothing that legally compels them to do it as there is in these other countries. And for the most part, they don't do it. In fact, any attempt to unionize the United States is often fought, including using harassing techniques and ways to try and discourage employees from doing anything that would give them any consultation rights in their businesses at all. So again, there are differences between countries, but comparing Europe to America, it's really, you're just living in different worlds when it comes to these sorts of things. What was your second? Supermajorities. Well, at the European level, maybe we'll see the sclerosis that we see in the United States now as a result of supermajorities. Maybe we'll see that. Certainly, you've seen in Europe times where they've been criticized for not getting their act together, acting like a bunch of national tribes and such things. And voting thresholds are important in any body that's trying to make decisions, no doubt about it. But I'll say this: despite these sorts of national thresholds that they have at the EU level, they've been able to pass things like requiring works councils, requiring some degree of co-determination, requiring other supports for workers, requiring certain environmental standards that the U.S. is still trying to do. So the proof at the end of the day is in the pudding. And in just so many ways, I think that Europe is showing that it's able to. But now it doesn't mean at some point, if their thresholds are too high and they're too divided and they're too polarized, that they won't be able to make decisions. And some decisions don't get made. But for one example, I think that shows the European way of decision making, which can really look kind of chaotic sometimes, was in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, where the whole world was scrambling around for what is going to be the response. And initially you saw the headlines, France had its plan, Spain had its plan, Germany, Britain, they all had their plans. And the headlines were Europe can't decide anything. It's running around like a chicken with its head chopped off. And the U.S. Treasurer Hank Paulson had his plan. Well, eventually, within about 10 days, it was determined that the plan that Gordon Brown in the UK, Prime Minister of the UK, had come up with of recapitalizing the banks was the one that was going to bring the quickest stability and the most confidence in the banks, so there wouldn't be a run on the banks. And then quickly, France, Germany, the other countries of Europe all adopted the Gordon Brown plan. And then even Hank Paulson adopted the Gordon Brown plan because it made sense. But the interesting thing about it was that the initial story was Europe can't get its act together. And of course, in the 24-hour news cycle that we live in today, that's where the story ended, unless you really followed it. And so the stories were never reported at the end that actually Europe did get its act together. They came up with a plan. It was determined to be the best plan, and the U.S. actually ended up following that plan. So the second part of the story never got told, and sometimes I think that's what happens a lot in America. We see the initial headline. In fact, throughout 2006, you could still see stories about Europe's sclerotic economy, and yet the numbers were showing that Europe's economy had surpassed the United States in major key ways, especially as we led up to what became the economic collapse. And there was actually a story in Newsweek International that talked about the Europe's job machine, how Europe was creating more jobs than the United States was in 2006, but that story never appeared in the Newsweek domestic version. And so I think there's a lot of that goes on where we don't hear the full story in the United States about what's going on in Europe.
Let me pick up on that point and change the topic a little bit back to the energy question. And do you think that the investment and the innovation that Europe's been engaged in on energy and transportation over the last 20 years, has it proved the thesis around the green jobs argument that is going through Washington right now, that essentially President Obama and the Democrats are trying to push sustainable energy and as a jobs program.
Right.
And these are energy and jobs are two of the big agenda items for 2010, assuming that healthcare moves forward, which is a big assumption. Has Europe proved it? Has European economic growth over the last 10, 20 years, what has been the impact of this innovation in the energy sector and transportation sector?
The figures I have are mostly from Germany, and Germany certainly has been the leader in Europe on these sorts of things, where they've created about several 100,000 jobs in Germany. The equivalent, if based on population, would be if the U.S. had created about 1.5 million jobs, based on what Germany's numbers are. And other countries I've not been able to find figures on, but you hear this a lot, that this is a jobs program, that we are going to create new jobs through this. And I've seen no evidence to indicate that it hasn't created jobs. And in Germany, there's quite a bit of evidence that it's created quite a few jobs.
Okay. The lady in red back there.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a primary care physician, and my question is about health care. I understand why the insurance companies in this country oppose it. I understand about what's the matter with Kansas. What I don't understand is why places like New America and the Center for American Progress, where I used to work, are so sold on the idea of providing health insurance by market competition between private for-profit insurance companies. That's the only model they'll consider, and that's the Obama plan. And why is there so much resistance to, say, a German-type plan where the insurance companies are still there, but they perform an administrative function? They don't perform a risk-bearing function, and everyone is covered for everything.
Well, I can't speak for New America on healthcare. We would need to have their director here, Len Nichols, who was part of the Clinton task force in the 90s and is just extremely knowledgeable on healthcare and the whys and why nots. But I can tell you that my sense is that it really comes down to just political vote counting. They know they do need 60 votes in the Senate or close to it, and that it's going to be a tough sell. And so they don't even start down the road of something that they think is going to be a tough sell. That's really what it comes down to. You have seen some states trying to do these sorts of things, and that seems to be where the laboratory starts happening. And even in San Francisco, where I live, they've managed to pass health care for everyone. And when you go and when you eat in a restaurant, for example, there's a little line item now. It says health care, and that's for the waiters and the cooks and such in the restaurants. So. Why can't we do it? Why can't we make insurance companies nonprofits? Well, yeah, and I think it's something that we used to have. Remember, part of it is values and what's happened to the attitudes in this country, where we used to have, for example, a regulated energy market, and the energy companies were allowed to make a certain amount of profit, but no more, right? And then we deregulated everything. It was supposed to make energy so cheap your meter would run backwards, right? Well, we know what happened with that. And so really, I think in the United States, we're suffering from a failed mythology, a failed philosophy that deregulating all these things was somehow going to produce what we need. And I think hopefully we're learning a lesson that actually government does play an important role. But what that role is going to be has to be negotiated through the political process. But if your political process is broken, then you can't make that negotiation. And so we're sort of, in America right now, we're in this double bind where I think we are trying to renegotiate the myths we've lived by since Ronald Reagan declared government is the problem in his first inaugural address. But the political process is not one that is lending itself very well to this conversation, as well as at a certain point the conversation, when you come up with the new crystallization of the new philosophy, it has to transform itself into policy. It has to solidify into something. And that's, at that critical juncture, if something doesn't happen, the energy can start doing some strange things, like we just discovered in Massachusetts, right? Where people voted what you'd think is against their own interests in certain ways, but because they're just frustrated. They're looking at the political process and saying nothing's happening. We can't even do health care right. And so I think we're facing some real challenges in the United States because at the federal level, the political process I think we're seeing is quite broken in a way that is going to be hard to fix.
Great, thanks. Gentleman in the back. Yeah, actually your neighbor, and then we'll come to you.
Oh.
Thanks.
Francesco Barbacian with the IISS. I'm going to posit that the basic difference between Europe and the US comes down to freedom to and freedom from. In the US, we believe more in freedom to, the freedom to do as you wish, to choose as you wish, whatever. Whereas in Europe, they believe more in freedom from. And obviously, there's various scales along that. Essentially, freedom from hunger, freedom from illness, stuff like that. And so if you buy into that premise, and I welcome your thoughts on that, then in order to move towards a more European model here, we need a change in kind of outlook and a shift more from the freedom to the freedom from on the spectrum. And so, if you do buy into that premise, the question is, how do we do that? Obviously, I think there's a big debate in this country about that, where liberals are tainted more as the people who believe in freedom from, and, the right believes more in freedom to bear guns, whatever you want to do. But it's your choice to do that. And so, again, I come back to the basic divide is going to be, how do you shift the opinion or the political discourse in this country towards that way?
Well, I guess I would not agree with the premise about freedom to and freedom from. I haven't found the Europeans that I know to be freedom from sort of people. I mean, to me, as I have observed their societies, having things like health care and all of the things that they have is about freedom too. It's about freedom to be able to live your life and feel some degree of support that you're not, I mean, the Bush administration tried to push the ownership society. But, the real name for that is on your own society. You're on your own to live or not, and good luck. We're not going to do a whole lot to help you. You just go out there and work hard. Well, Europeans work hard. They pay their taxes, and they also have these supports. I mean, it was sort of an epiphany for me. I don't know where I was. I think it was in Paris, or maybe it was somewhere else. And standing on a street corner and realizing, all the people walking by me right now, they all have health care. They all have, all the things we've been talking about. Paid parental leave, child care. They have all these access to all these things that make them feel like their lives don't have to be so insecure. When you think about the amount of crime in the United States, the U.S. has an incarceration rate 7 to 10 times of European countries. In fact, one of the points I make in the book, when you try to figure out unemployment rates, you really should be figuring in the incarceration rate, because really by not doing that, the U.S. unemployment rate is about 1.2% lower than it would be, because people who are incarcerated are not counted in the unemployment rate. And we have so many people who are incarcerated. We have so much crime in the United States compared to European countries. And I think that part of the reason why is because of this insecurity we have. In the U.S., everyone's on their own. You're scrambling up the ladder. You're trying to get the best you can. It's sort of dog eat dog. The estimates are that, for example, for retirement, the average American needs to save about $250,000 to $300,000 to supplement their Social Security to just live a decent retirement. And the number of Americans that have actually saved that amount is like 25%. Whereas in Europe, the average government pension is going to pay, in the United States, you're going to get about 50% of the money you need to retire from Social Security. In Europe, it's going to be about 80 to 85%. Some countries are as high as 90%. So again, it's a different sense of well-being that you have when you feel like these things are taken care of in such a way that you don't have to be squirreling money away, stuffing money into your IRAs, your 401ks, and all these sorts of things. And there's flux going on in Europe on these things, of course, as well. I'm sure people will point out. But the point is that I think freedom too is about being able to live your life, and having what you think you need in order to feel secure in the world. And increasingly in this global capitalized world, where you have China and India and Brazil and other countries who are coming up and knocking on the door, and they want what we have. It's going to be a very competitive world. And so what institutions and practices can you put in place to give your people the support they need in this world that's only emerging? I mean, this world is not here yet, believe me. It's still coming into view. But we can see kind of what it's going to look like. And that's where I have come down, in that the European way really is, in many ways, the best way as a development model for the 21st century, because it's efficient, they don't waste their money, they provide good, healthy support for their families and individuals. They're doing it in a way that's as ecologically sustainable as a modern society can, and they're somewhat limited by, they can only go so far down that road until the U.S. and China start joining them going down that road. And I just think that it's working marvelously well. It has its problems, for sure. I have one section of the book called "Europe, Will It Last?" As I look at things like immigration and others, this is a work in progress. There's no guarantees here. But, the European way is actually not just Europe. Anybody can copy the European way. And that's where I think the United States needs to start looking at.
Okay, and then the neighbor, and then we'll bring it up here.
Okay, I'm Andrew Holland from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I've done a lot of work recently on climate change in Europe. And you're right, they have been remarkably effective in their policies. But the effect of these policies has been to increase energy prices per kilowatt hour are in the range of 2 to 4 times higher than they are here. And of course, gas prices, we all know, are much higher over there than they are here. What is it that, and kind of this feeds through to higher cost of living and a lot of things, but what is the difference between, I guess, American consumers and European consumers that make them willing to bear these higher costs, higher energy costs, higher gasoline costs, without the kind of overwhelming pushback that we see in the United States whenever anybody talks about anything to increase consumer costs? Why do Europeans?
Well, it's not as if the Europeans don't grumble about high taxes and grumble about gas, cost of energy, and all these sorts of things. But I think they, for various reasons, in part because their political democracy does allow this more pervasive conversation between the political center and the political wings, and more people are just informed about these issues, and they understand the predictions about global warming. But also, I think that Americans are ready to make these changes. I think Americans in part elected Barack Obama because on the campaign, he spoke about making these changes. And Americans, my own family, I have a large family, a range of points of view from Republicans to Democrats, left, right. And most of them voted for Barack Obama because they said, okay, we've got to make these changes, we're ready. The problem is that the political system can't deliver. That's the real problem that America faces right now. The political system cannot deliver. And so, as I say, the public, I believe, is ready. Maybe not as much as Europeans are. But, again, you got to take these things in steps, right? You can only go the next step. You can't go the next 5 steps. But if America goes the next step, then it allows Europe to go the next step. And we're all in lockstep at this point. Some are at one place, and others at another place. But Europe can't go much further until the United States and China do. And so I think Americans are ready, but we're seeing on healthcare the tremendous frustration that the nation is experiencing that something hasn't been passed by now. And I think what happened in the election in Massachusetts on Tuesday was a reflection of that. It's sort of like, I hate to use, maybe this is an overstated metaphor, but it's sort of like a coyote in its trap that's chewing its own leg off. That's kind of what the political system in the United States is like at this point, because people were ready for that change. It's not happening. They're ready for global climate change policy. That's not happening, and people are getting frustrated.
Okay, one more question to get that image out of our heads, right here in the corner.
Yeah, Charter and Freedom's correspondent. What are the basic European value, and what's the challenge face them now and in the future? And one thing I see very different between EU and US is that they work together, and here is work for each other. For example, in the occupational safety and health area, in Europe, the government, labor, and manage work together. But in here, they fight among themselves. And in the global
warming, so what are the core values is the question.
Yeah, and there's in Europe, I know they have tried the cap and trade system twice, but twice fair. And I don't know you talk about this or not. And one thing that puzzles me is this. Now the U.S. try to follow them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, in terms of the core values, if I were to define them briefly, I would say that Europe it's a place of social capitalism as opposed to Wall Street capitalism. It's a place that still relies to a large degree on manufacturing and exports, as opposed to the United States, which is more its economy much more relies on financial wealth. Britain, of course, is more like the United States in that way. So you've got a social capitalism, export, manufacturing, and taking the wealth that is created to give more support to families and individuals, and trying to do that as ecologically sustainable way as possible. That really, in some ways, sums up Europe, because as Patrick started out this program with, the real challenge today is how are we going to take a burgeoning population of 6.5 billion people in the world, and how are we going to allow them to enjoy what we all have enjoyed in the wealthy Western societies, and do that in a way that doesn't destroy the planet in the process. This is the real challenge of the 21st century. And in looking at that challenge, I think Europe really comes closest to having something, a way that we need to follow, that we need to start figuring out how to do some version of ourselves. It won't be an exact copy of Europe, of course. America has its own traditions, its own cultures, and these sorts of things. But creating a society that does good things for your people in an ecologically sustainable way, no one has a patent on that. There's all sorts of ways to do it. Europe has a certain way. Japan is doing its version of it. Australia is trying to cope with it. Canada is too. In some ways, the U.S. is the outlier here at this point. We're doing less than a lot of these other countries are in all these different ways. And so I think it's really about the U.S. having a conversation with ourselves, looking around the world, not having our heads filled with so many myths about places like Europe, so that we can have a real conversation that doesn't rely on stereotypes and that can move the conversation forward. That's what I tried to do in Europe's Promise, and hopefully today was also part of that process.
Thank you, Stephen, so much for coming today.